So I think while we're waiting, I'm going to just make some announcements, folks. First of all, next week, Professor Paula Finland from the History Department right here is going to be here talking to us about Galileo. I don't know what she's going to say. But we are putting up, even as I speak, is it already up there? Wonderful. The letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, penned or by Galileo with some help, but nevertheless a very important document from this period. You'll enjoy reading it, I think. It's on the interpretation of Scripture. These are principles that are actually provided by Galileo. We'll find them, I think, pretty reasonable today, for our modern sensibilities, but they were controversial when he wrote them when he did. And that might provide a good background to Professor Finland's lecture. We're also going to try to get some of the recommended readings up there as well for you. We'll get those up in the next 2 to 3 days probably. We'll work it out. Oliver's having some problems at home with his computer, so.
Tomorrow I'll be in my office.
Yeah. Anyway, that's going to be very exciting. I'm looking forward to our Galileo evening. I happen to be over in the library, and I'm sure some of you get over to Green once in a while and might have seen Athanasius Kircher's magnetic clock by any chance. There's a reconstruction of it there in the main reading room. Athanasius Kircher was a Jesuit sort of everything, polymath type, and seemed to know everybody, one of those kinds of Jesuits, but Professor Finland has done a lot of work on Athanasius Kircher, and I suspect she might even bring some of that into play in her lecture next week. But I would suggest going up there and taking a look at it. There's an exhibit that goes along with it in the library on what they're calling secular manuscripts. They did one on sacred manuscripts a few months ago. Now they're doing secular manuscripts. And I did just happen to look at one of them. I have to tell you, just a minute. It's on my phone. I took a picture of the label because I have something to say about it. Just a minute. Technology, isn't it amazing? All right, here's the label. So there's a little sidebar there, and it's attributed to, they're talking about a guy named Coluccio Salutati, 1331 to 1406, who wrote a work called De Seculo et Religione, which they have translated as regarding the secular and the religious, which is not a very good translation. It's actually, a better translation would be regarding the world and religion. And religion in those days meant a certain piety and morals, but not religion in the kind of the taxonomic way in which we think of it today, much less theology. So I thought I might write to the people who wrote that little sidebar and let them know, but I haven't done that yet. Anyway, it's worth looking at. I also want to just show you the website for those. How many have been visiting the website from time to time? Oh, good. Well, I hardly have to show you anything. But I want to show you one new thing. Resources right here. I've added I'm going to be adding things as we move along. There's a letter by the former Pope John Paul II to George Coyne on the relationship between religion and science that is really, I think, you might appreciate more after Oliver's presentation tonight. The second is an article by Terry Eagleton on Richard Dawkins. Terry Eagleton is an amazing scholar who probably knows Dawkins better than almost anybody else. I'm afraid he skewers him in this article, so it's a little prejudice of me to put it up here. And then the YouTube conversation between Richard Dawkins and George Coyne. Now, the other thing I wanted to go through with you is some of you are taking this for credit, 1 unit or 2 units of credit. And so what we'll be asking from you for 1 unit of credit is a 5-page paper on a topic raised in the course or any other topic that you might want to come up with. Using 1 or 2 course readings or other readings that you might come up with. For 2 quarters, 2 units, it would be 2 5-page papers or a 1 10-page paper. So it's very simple. And these are not major research papers. Don't fret about these. The point is for you to raise a question and to put forth an argument. So the purpose of the paper is that you gain deeper insight into the scope of your question, not that you answer it, okay? So this is an opportunity for you to work out some ideas, some thoughts on paper. That's what it is. It does not have to be heavily footnoted. If you want to add some footnotes, that's fine, go ahead. I'm not asking for MLA or Chicago or anything else, just be consistent, all right? The only thing we do ask is double-spaced, and 12-point is really great for old eyes. So if you can remember that would be terrific. And no cover sheets. Word is preferred to anything else, although I can open it up in Pages. And then here I just give you some possible topics, and these are not so much topics as questions. I took my cue from Thomas Aquinas, who starts everything with the word utrum, weather. And you can go through some of these yourselves. These are just ideas, open-ended questions to kind of maybe get you started. But you probably have other questions that you're bringing to the table, all right? So any 3 of us will be happy to talk to you, at least via email, about whatever you may want to come up with for a topic. This is all on the web, so I'm not going to go over all the questions. And I also, while I was here today, I saw some students, and I will be here again a week from Wednesday, before our Wednesday night session. So I'll be here from 3 to roughly 5:15, because we'll be doing our Heidegger reading after that. So I'll have a couple of hours there, and we'll send out another message to people. So if you want to sign up and just to get together and talk to me about anything, including your papers, I'm here for that. And I'll be scheduling times like that for the successive weeks as well. All right? Good. Let's see. What did I do with my paper? This is like trying to get out of the house in the morning. What did I do with my glasses, you know? Oh, yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. The one final thing is we are going to be asking everyone to hold your questions until after the presentations. So the way it's going to work is once I hand the show over to Oliver, he will complete his presentation. We'll take a break, then we'll come back for questions and discussion, okay? That'd be a little bit easier to kind of maneuver through and give everybody an opportunity to kind of collect their thoughts and pose some whatever questions you might want to pose or challenges you might want to pose all in good spirit. Okay? So what I'd like to do in just kind of opening up tonight's presentation on Ian Barber is to restate the question that we have been looking at so far. Okay. So to begin with, we could ask, have the paradigms and methods of the natural sciences supplanted the paradigms of religion, and particularly of theology, as overarching interpretive structures of reality? Has that happened? I think it is fair to say that that has happened, that the world that we inhabit, the way in which we look at reality and basically interpret it on an everyday basis is very much framed by the paradigms and methods of the natural sciences. And that's one of the reasons why it's difficult for some of us to imagine religion, much less theology, having much to offer to the conversation. I think we all inhabit that space, whether we are explicitly religious or not, whether we're atheistic. I think that's something that we all have in common. But what we have been saying the last couple of weeks is that this does not end the discussion either. It's not as though that therefore makes the topic of this course a possible dialogue between religion and science a moot question or a false question. And what Oliver was inviting us to consider both the first night and then last week is that both religion and the natural sciences operate from certain sets of presuppositions, which he illustrated in great detail. But these presuppositions essentially boil down to the conviction that what we are looking at is intelligible, that even though the universe is riddled with chaos and unpredictability, and we don't know maybe precisely when the next asteroid is going to hit. I was just reading about that the other day. Nevertheless, there is something intelligible. Otherwise, if this presupposition of intelligibility were not operative, we really wouldn't be able to do normal science. So the word for that is metaphysics, essentially. We're talking about something that is real, something that is intelligible, something that is coherent. At least parts of it are. At least parts of it are. Not the whole, but in parts. So if the ordinary investigations of the biological and physical sciences are involved with problem solving, then they have to assume some kind of a context of meaning or the possibility of meaning within which solutions can be recognized and discovered, and intelligibility. And such a context of meaning must have some real grounding, a relation to the human beings, that's you and me, who are undertaking the work, in this case, of science, and who are affected by it. And so the sciences, just as much as religion, are implicated in a certain kind of metaphysics, at least one that bears upon epistemology, how we go about knowing things. Now, this is realized by many theologians and religious scholars and philosophers of science, though regrettably not by all representatives of religion. And all of whom are interested in the construction of some kind of coherent intellectual culture, some kind of worldview, Weltanschauung, that will make theology also make sense. And what they're looking for is some kind of a picture that is at the same time intellectually honest. And so part of that intellectual honesty for theology is taking into account the picture of the world that has been presented by the natural sciences. A theology that proceeds without taking into account what the natural sciences are providing us by way of interpretation of reality is not a fully honest theology. So I thought to just kind of kick things off, I have 3 very brief slides here. I'd start off with the late Pope John Paul II, and many of us have mixed feelings about the pontificate of John Paul II, but one of the areas in which he did make a strong contribution was in the area of religion and science. And there's just a whole lot of stuff on this, but he really broke open a lot of the categories in which people had been stuck. And in a letter to George Coyne, who was then the director of the Vatican Observatory, he said that we need to encourage an openness on the part of theology toward science. And by encouraging an openness, he said, we're not envisioning a disciplinary unity between theology and science. As dialogue and common searching continue, there will be growth towards mutual understanding and a gradual uncovering of common concerns, which will provide the basis for further research and discussion. In the process, we must overcome every regressive tendency to a unilateral reductionism, to fear, and to self-imposed isolation. And he's talking here about theologians, not just scientists. Okay. Now, after Oliver presents, you'll probably be able to see this in the context of one of the models that Barber presents. But he is certainly talking about the possibility of dialogue. He's also talking about a certain kind of unity. Again, this is not a uniformitarianism where one absorbs the other. Unity is not identity. The church does not propose that science should become religion or religion become science. That's part of the mistake that was made in the past. On the contrary, unity always presupposes the diversity and the integrity of its elements. Each of these members should become not less itself, but more itself in a dynamic interchange for a unity in which one of the elements, if reduced to the other, is destructive, false in its promises of harmony, and ruinous of the integrity of its components. So it would be a unity of worldview, if you will, but without one being reduced to the other. And then he asks, of course, obviously theology can benefit from this, but can science benefit? Because sometimes the presupposition is that science has a lot to offer theology, and it does. Does religion have anything to offer science? It would seem that it should, for science develops best when its concepts and conclusions are integrated into the broader human culture and its concerns for meaning and value. Scientists cannot, therefore, hold themselves entirely aloof from the sorts of issues dealt with by philosophers and theologians. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. So it's in that kind of a spirit, then, that we've undertaken the course so far. And so what we're going to be looking at now is, more specifically, and again, this is going to be through Oliver's presentation here, how we could go about arriving at such a vision, or whether it's even possible. And Ian Barber is going to give us 4 distinct approaches to that problem.
As Paul said, what we were trying to do so far was really just laying out the field of the two parties that are involved in this conversation. So what is science? What does it do? I'm sorry? I know, I will try, but I hope I'll get through. Okay, so we've been trying to talk about what is theology, what is science, what are the presuppositions they have, how do they do what they do. That was something that we wanted to lay out first before we can now try to talk about how can they possibly be related to each other. Can they be related in a productive way? And to help us negotiate these waters, we will look at Ian Barber. Now, Ian Barber was a physicist, a trained physicist and a theologian. He unfortunately died on Christmas Eve last year. And in his early days, these 2 books, this is Issues in Science and Religion, and this was in 1966, and this is Myths, Models, and Paradigms, that was in 1974. And in these 2 books, he really started to come up with the methodological questions. How can we relate these two? And he was starting there to develop a typology of 4 ways of how people usually approach the relationship and the intersection of religion and science. And as all typologies, they're helpful to negotiate what's going on. You will find that certain approaches will fall into 2 categories or will maybe not even meet 1. But overall, it helps to understand what is at stake here. the categories that he, or the types that he proposes, have specific metaphysical presuppositions that come into play, and that makes it interesting for us and for the question that we're after here. So, these are, as if you read the text, if you read the chapter, these are the four types of, these four models of interaction that Barber suggests: conflict, independence, and dialogue. And we'll start right away with the conflict model. Now, what characterizes the conflict model is basically this: God versus science, right? This was on a cover of Time magazine, and there was a conversation between Richard Dawkins and Francis Collins. And of course, if you have this head-butting approach that sells newspapers and is good for TV shows or internet productions, the question is it really helpful? Now, Barber analyzes this approach, I think, quite helpfully and in a really productive way. So what I wanted to show you here is these are the icons, of course, of the conflict, right? This is, does anyone know who, you know who this is, right? This is, right, Galileo in front of the Inquisition, right? Sinister looking churchman and a brave helmsman, facing the onslaught. That's one icon. And then the other icon that you get on the other side is, of course, this, right? Darwin as, people will say, a monkey. Of course, it's not a monkey, it's an ape, right? No tail, we know that. Silly thing. Right, so these are the icons that show this is what the war between religion and science is all about. Now, what Barber says is the following thing. He says what categorizes the conflict approach is actually that you have two positions, very extreme, and this is the interesting thing, that operate with the more or less the same premises. And what are those? Well, first, they agree that science and religion are irreconcilable opposites. Right? They both, you talk to proponents of that approach on either side, they will say these two things don't go together. That's why it's a conflict approach. And they both insist that you can seek knowledge with certain foundation. So those who would fall on the science side, so to say, would say that logic and sense data give you what you need to get certainty. That would be what we call scientific materialism. And on the religion side, you would have the infallibility of Scripture, biblical literalism. Right? And of course, at that point, you can have only one. It's like in this bad 80s movie, Highlander, right? There can only be one, right? That's it. You try to chop off the other's head to get stronger. It's a bad movie, bad reference, but sometimes it works. Not in this crowd. Okay, good. One tries. So you have basically a choice between these extreme positions, and it can be only one or the other. All right. Now, what is this? I would like to look at these two positions a little bit more in detail, as Barber does, and just go over that because it's really helpful. What is scientific materialism? What characterizes scientific materialism? Now, Barber distinguishes two presuppositions of scientific materialism. One, he calls epistemological, and that is that science is the only way to knowledge. Okay? The second one would be a metaphysical or ontological one, namely that matter, pacha to the physicists, or matter and energy, whatever matter might be, is the fundamental reality in the universe. Okay? So these are the two presuppositions that he suggests. And oftentimes you will find that scientific materialism leads straight into reductionism. And if you look at reductionism in detail, basically, again, you can look at an epistemological reductionism that kind of takes it a little further. Here now, all theories of science can be reduced to the laws of physics and chemistry. So if you're a biologist, what you need to know most is physics and chemistry. Because everything that you see, be it behavior, be it an evolution, be it natural selection, all these things can be reduced basically to physics and chemistry. Okay? Well, on the metaphysical end, that would mean that the component parts of a system constitute its most fundamental reality. So you look at poor, tired students who try to get through this lecture here. all they are really particles, right? Matter interacting. That's it. So we can reduce all of us to the underlying elementary particles, right? And at that point, the conclusion is really that reality is only comprehensively explained in terms of actions of material components. Done deal. Okay? Well, one might then say, and you have heard me talk about this before, and actually this was where I wanted to bring it in, but it came up before. Let's do this one more time. Science is the only way to the truth. I will talk about why that is problematic in a second. You might be familiar with these thinkers, logical positivists of the 20th century, who really followed that or adopted this way of thinking. Here are Moritz Schlick and Rudolf Carnap of the Vienna Circle. And the Vienna Circle famously put forward a paper in which, a manifesto in which they actually asked or demanded that all language has to be substituted by another language, a more exact language, and that language would, of course, be the language of science, because that's the only language in which you can express anything that is real. If you're a reductionist, that would make sense, right? Bertrand Russell, who was the doctoral advisor of Ludwig Wittgenstein, picked up some of Wittgenstein's idea, drove him a little further into the extremes, and then Ayer picked this up later on in the 1940s. Here you really have the modern logical positivists who adopted also reductionism. In recent times, these are, as you've heard me say that before, the logical positivists in short pants, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sim Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. Now here you see the same approach. It's a materialist approach, it's a reductionistic approach, but it lacks, I think, the philosophical depth that you at least see with a logical positivist, if I may say so. But that's a personal opinion. You might disagree, and we might have a chance to talk about it later. Now, what are the problems of reductionistic materialism? As I said, the denial of a metaphysical position is a metaphysical thesis. Right? You can't get around that problem. So if you say science is the only way to the truth, as I said before, you're making a claim that is ultimately paradoxical. Right? Because the claim itself is not scientific. So therefore, if the statement were true, that indeed science is the only way to the truth, the statement itself as a truth claim would be meaningless, right? Because it's not scientific. However, if it were meaningful, well, then the statement would be simply false. So at that point, I think it's pretty clear why this reductionistic approach really leads you into a problem, into a problematic space, and that is you're basically founding your argument on a paradoxical claim, and that needs to be unpacked. I'm not exactly sure how one can unpack that or get over it, but that's one of the challenges I see this approach faces. Well, on the other side, we have biblical literalism, and that's not necessarily an easier approach. Here, the Bible is supposedly read literally and thereby reveals absolute truth. Right? That would be the presupposition here. In other words, as Milton Terry once said, a fundamental principle in the grammatico-historical exposition is that the words and sentences can have but one significance in one and the same connection. The moment we neglect this principle, we drift out upon a sea of uncertainty and conjecture. Well, is that possible? Well, Ken Ham certainly thinks so. I mean, I don't know if you have seen him online recently. He had this debate with Bill Nye and argued that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, right? And when asked whether he would actually, what kind of evidence he would accept to change his mind, he would say none, right? He said that he would never change his mind because the Bible is literal, is to be read literal, and is the truth. Okay. Well, what's the problem of biblical literalism? It's pretty obvious. No text can be read without interpretation. Right? I mean, language is always symbolical. Words are multivalent. Utterances have a surplus of meaning, as Paul Ricoeur once said. what I'm telling you here, you cannot really take literal. I mean, you have to, by the mere meaning of the words, what you have to do is you have to interpret what I'm saying. If I go shopping and I have a shopping list and I stand in front of, I'm in the supermarket and I'm reading buy diapers and I'm looking at the diapers and I'm thinking, okay, which ones am I going to buy? Right? Which size? Well, that's easy, okay, but then overnights or whatever, and then Pampers, the other ones, which ones, okay? So interpretation is always something that you have even with the most simplest of texts. Let's not forget the contradictions in the biblical text. How do you deal with those? Now, you will find that biblical literalists will come up with certain explanatory models which seem like ad hoc approaches, but you have to ask yourself, how many times did Moses go up the mountain? Who went with him? And all these questions, right? So that's something we have to deal with, which basically means we cannot read things literally in the Bible. And of course, it ignores decades of Judeo-Christian exegetical research. So the conflict perspective really considers religion and science irreconcilable. No productive relationship is possible. At that point, all we have is basically, well, TV coverage, and we can sit back, have a beer, eat some chips, and see them throw mud at each other. But there's no productivity here, right? This is unfortunately what we see very often. And this is unfortunately, which I find that very unfortunate, actually. It's what a lot of people believe to be the case, although they feel it shouldn't be, and they don't know how to deal with that. Right? So what Barber suggests is the second category would be independence, and independence goes just a step further. And people who follow that approach give you something that might be called a truce, if you like. Basically, it is this, Barber says, it's two positions, and they have different premises. Okay? The premises avoid a conflict between science and religion simply because science and religion are seen as independent and autonomous fields. And that's very comfortable. Okay? Now you do your science, and I do my theology, or vice versa. Okay? Having been a scientist and a theologian, that's kind of out. Okay, so I have to be split-brained or kind of crazy. Okay, fine. But that is a very comfortable place because you truly avoid conflict. You can basically say we ask different questions, we use different methods to answer those questions. So therefore, there cannot be a conflict. It's easy, right? The two approaches that Barber brings up is contrasting methods and differing languages. So it's basically the first part would be to say, well, a theologian does not run experiments. There is no empirical work here being done in theology. So therefore, two different things. So you can't have a problem. And you approach different questions anyway. The differing languages, what Barber is talking about here is basically what Wittgenstein is talking about with the language games, right? So you have to speak the language of the game you're playing. And since that doesn't work with religion and science, well, it doesn't work. You cannot play the same game, right? So in other words, you cannot play football. I mean, as I said before, soccer, right? The real football, the one that you actually play with your foot and don't pick up with your hands. I don't know what that means, but then I'm European, so I apologize. Simon, any ideas? No, okay, well. So if you cannot play football and use baseball rules. That doesn't make any sense, right? So in order to really have a good game going, you either play one or the other, and at the end of the day, a football player and a baseball player can go to a bar, have a beer, and say, boy, was that a good day? But they cannot really play the game together. Putting it easy here. An example on the theologian side would be Langdon Gilkey, and he actually gives you a good example of what Barber is talking about. He says, science explains objective data, right? Religion asks about order and beauty and our inner life. So obviously, two very different fields of inquest. Science asks how, religion why. In science, the authority is logical coherence and experimental adequacy. In religion, God and revelation. So you see, no conflict here. There's also no overlap. There's not much of a conversation at all. Right? Two separate fields, very easy. Science makes quantitative, testable predictions. Religion uses symbolic language about a transcendent God. No problem. That can be very helpful if you feel that you don't want a conflict and you can't see how you can relate those two more productively. You just, say, look, you do yours, I do mine, everything is fine. Not very satisfying, though, for the believer who also wants to understand the world scientifically. Now, Stephen Jay Gould, late evolutionary biologist, said this: no such conflict between theology or religion and science should exist because each subject has a legitimate magisterium. Note the bow to the Catholic Church here, or domain of teaching authority, and these magisteria do not overlap the principle that I would like to designate as noma, or non-overlapping magisteria. For him, religion deals with questions of ethics. Science deals with questions of reality, of physical reality. Right? So at that point, no problem. Well, at least not at the surface. Right? According to the independence perspective, religion or theology and science use different methods to ask different kind of questions, not in conflict. But again, not very satisfying for those who believe and find themselves in the scientific world and think that science actually has to say something meaningful. Now, the third category that Barber suggests is the dialogue category, and this was the one that John Paul II was talking about. You'll see that JP2's approach is very similar to what Barber here calls the dialogue approach, okay? And what he means by that is basically that you have two positions that have a creative interaction. What he means by that is that there is a partial independence between science and theology, a partial independence, not a full and entire independence. You can focus on similarities and overlap rather than the differences, and by focusing on the overlaps, you can actually have a meaningful conversation. Now, it's true they are distinct domains, and yet, and this is interesting, there seems to be shared language. Barber looks at three particular approaches: the presuppositions and limit questions that help you into this, the methodological parallels that help to bring about the dialogue, and then the third one is nature-centered spirituality. Now, what he means by limit questions is basically this: science can raise questions that science cannot answer. Now, if you think about the possibilities of modern medicine, if you think about the science that went into the production of weapons, all these raise questions of an ethical nature. They raise questions of meaning. And you cannot run an experiment to see what ethics you should apply or what the meaning is of human life and how you can or cannot test it, use it in medical tests, right? So limit questions are questions that are raised within a particular area in a particular discipline, but cannot be answered by that discipline. For the dialogue approach, this means that certain questions that are raised, for example, the medical ethics, questions in medical ethics, theologians can address, taking the science very seriously. It's not to say that they should ignore the science. They have to understand the science in order to then relate it to ideas in moral theology in order to come to a suggestion or maybe even a solution. That would be the first approach. The second approach that he suggests is this methodological parallels, and this is really an interesting approach. This is Barber, and a lot of people find that to be pushing the envelope a little too far. So I'll just explain what he means by that, and then maybe we can discuss it a little more later on. Basically, what he says is that science and religion have the same overall structure. So in science, you start with you have constants and theories. Now, these constants and theories, he argues, you can test. Fair enough. How can you test them? Through the hypothetico-deductive testing of a method of testing predictions. So you have predictions. If you can falsify those predictions are, the theory is basically out. If you can't falsify them, the theory is the best possible explanation and sticks around. Now, if you test it, what you get is data, right? The data will determine whether you can falsify a theory or not. Now, what Barber says is the problem is that there are no observations that are not influenced by theories. Right? I mean, basically what he's saying is no scientist is ever really truly objective. They cannot be. They work, if you want, we mentioned, not quite as in detail as I had wanted, but we mentioned last time Thomas Kuhn and the idea of paradigms. So we are, as scientists, working within a paradigm, even if we do normal science. And this paradigm shapes very much how we see the world. And if we look at data, wrong button here. If we look at the data, what Barber says is theory will simply influence the observations that we have. So science is not as objective as it tries to be. It cannot be. Now, how do we get from observations to new theories? He says what we use is basically models, which for him are extended metaphors. And a metaphor is always something that lives from the tension of the is and is not. So think about it this way. If I say time is a river, if you take me to literal, then every time you see a river, you could say, look at the time, right? That's not what it is. The idea is, of course, that there is an is not, it's not water, but there is something about that metaphor that helps you to get to a meaning that otherwise you would not have. And that is that idea of time running, can't be stopped. You can dam it, you can dam a river, but you get the idea, right? So science actually uses, I'm always using the wrong button here, forgive me, uses models as extended metaphors. Scientists use analogies, and yes, scientists use imagination. So at that point, he argues that the process from observation to theories involves a lot of approaches, if you like, that are not quite as objective and clear as it is usually made out to be. How does that work in religion? He argues religion is, or theology for that matter, is similarly structured. You have concepts and beliefs, doctrines, which would be the same as, or analogically speaking, what we found in science as theories. And these, he believes, can be actually tested. Now, not in a hypothetico-deductive approach, but rather in an experiential testing of religious beliefs. So you have certain explanations in theology that then are checked against religious experience of the faithful, against the story and rituals. And then, if that does not chime, if the experience does not chime with what is put forth in the doctrines, you can reject that doctrine. That's what he argues. And again, we can discuss this afterwards, whether that is a good approach or not. He then says that here we find the same thing. Religious experience is affected by our beliefs. So there is no pure religious experience that is not affected by our religious ideas about the world or about God, about ultimate reality. And once we have those data, those religious data, if you like, how do we get from there, from our experience to our beliefs, to our doctrines? Well, it would be the same thing. It would involve models, analogies, and imagination. So this is how Barber works out the structural parallels between religion and science. I think that Ernest McMullin, the philosopher of science, really gives us a good approach of what people today think is or what the dialogue approach should be like. He says the Christian has to aim at some sort of coherence of worldview, a coherence to which science and theology, indeed many other sorts of human construction like history, politics, and literature, must contribute. He may, indeed must, strive to make his theology and his cosmology consonant, that's the operative word here, consonant, in the contributions they make to this worldview. By this consonance, but this consonance is a tentative relation, constantly under scrutiny and constant slight shift. Let me unpack this a little bit. First off, what does he mean by consonance? He basically takes this from Augustine, and Augustine's approach, which is of course not purely Augustine. I mean, this idea goes further back, that truth cannot contradict truth. So if you make truth claims in two areas, they only are at odds when they lead to a real contradiction. If they're not in contradiction, they can actually be consonant with each other. So if I have the idea of the creation of human beings through God on the one end, and I have on the other end, let's put it that way, the scientific explanation of the human being that we have in evolutionary biology, I can potentially find consonants. And the consonants would have to then take into consideration that while human beings came about through evolution, somehow God still carries that process, however that is being negotiated. So some people would say that God creates life or created human beings through the process of evolution. And at that point, you would have consonants. This is actually, I think, what most people in the field today do. They are looking for this consonance approach. Now, underlying this dialogue approach is a particular way of viewing reality. That's at least what Barber says. It has to do with the status of scientific theories as well as with the status of theological doctrines. Barber says the way, the metaphysical underlying idea here is critical realism. That's what he calls it. And by that he means basically that theories and doctrines are both abstract symbol systems which inadequately and selectively represent particular aspects of the world for specific purposes. Why is it inadequate and selective? For the same reason as McMullin said that this is always a shifting relationship between the two, because science changes and our interpretations in theology change too. Those are both evolving, right? If we were thinking of scientific theories in a naive realism as, if you like, photographic images of reality, then Barber thinks, along with some other philosophers, we run into a lot of problems. Well, if you think about what Karl Popper suggested, that what we can only know certain in science is that which we falsify rather than that which we prove, well, then you see where this is going. Does everyone remember how that worked with Popper, or do you want me to quickly? I see frowning faces. Okay. It's basically the problem of induction.
Has to be falsified.
Right.
Has to be proven wrong.
That's right. If you want to prove something, you would have to approach it inductively. Right? That's to say that you start basically with single observations and you then draw a general conclusion from it. So if I say all swans that I've ever seen are white, that would be the individual observations. I can say all swans are white. That would be my general claim, and then I can move on from there. Well, as David Hume said, two problems with that. There is no need, really. It might work that way, but there's no need to assume that just because it happened a million times, it has to happen again. So just because I saw so many white swans doesn't mean that I will always see white swans. So from that perspective, induction is problematic. Popper turns this sort of around and says, yeah, we cannot say with certainty, we cannot prove our theories with certainty because that would go along the way of induction. But what we can say is the moment we see a black swan, we have falsified the theory that all swans are white, and we can with certainty say this one is wrong. What that means is that all our theories that we have in science are not proven true. All our theories that we have in science are the best possible explanation at the time. Right? So from that perspective, things are inadequate because new scientific insights might actually, new data, new observations might actually show that our theories are not quite that on target. Think of Newton and Einstein, right? That would be an example. Now, approaching this critical realism, Barber says, maintains the intelligible world that exists independent from human observers. Remember, that was one of the metaphysical presuppositions. While avoiding the naive belief that scientific data simply mirror reality. And this is important for this approach. Theories and doctrines have to be taken seriously, not literally. That is the underlying metaphysical principle of this approach. So the dialogue model then views religion or theology and science as mutually beneficial disciplines, each with their independent methods, and yet both yield knowledge claims that are consummate. At that point, we've moved away from the conflict. We've moved away from the independence approach that helps us to have things easy but doesn't help us if we really want to bring these two things together, to an approach where there's actually a conversation that might benefit both scientists and believers. And finally, in the last approach, Barber suggests integration, or says that that's an approach that some thinkers prefer. He actually would fall into this integration approach himself. And here, theology and science are seen as two aspects of one worldview. So here you have no conflict between the two fields. They're dependent or interdependent. There are multiple methods, that's fine. It doesn't mean they're not dependent and closely related. And it results possibly in religious interpretations of scientific observations or in scientific practice. Now that can make people nervous. So I can say, okay, if I'm a believer, as Paul said, I have to, or a theologian has to know something about science. Otherwise, the doctrines that we come up with as theologians are bound to fail. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to ignore Big Bang cosmology or evolutionary biology and try to come up with a convincing doctrine of creation. Right? So we have to know science, fair enough. And how far does a scientist have to know religion? Well, they don't. I mean, you can be a perfectly happy biologist or physicist, and you don't have to know anything about religion to do your work. However, if you're a believing scientist, you might want to see that these two things have something to do with each other. You might want to bring those two together. Now, one way to think about that is not that you use prayer when you can't get your experiments to work. You do that, I know, even if you don't believe, right? But that's not what he means. It's also not this thing that, have you ever seen, it's not Gary Larson, but this cartoon where two scientists look at a blackboard. One explains the work to the other, and there are different steps, and a colleague who is being shown this stuff says, I think you should rethink step 5. And at step 5 it says, and then a miracle occurs. Right? That's not what he's talking about. It's not what he's talking about. But how do you choose between competing theories? There are theories that are competing, scientific theories, and there is no convincing data suggesting that one is true and the other one is false. The jury is simply out. How do you deal with that? Well, I'll give you an example of how Fred Hoyle dealt with that. Fred Hoyle was a physicist, a cosmologist, who did not like the Big Bang model. As a matter of fact, he gave the name Big Bang. Right? That was Fred Hoyle. What he meant to say is, yeah, and then there comes this Big Bang, right? Boom. Because this Catholic priest and physicist said there is a cosmic egg. Right. Huh? Because that's what actually Lemaitre said. He said there was a cosmic egg from which everything started. And what was his response? Now, he was an atheist. He didn't want that. This theory of a Big Bang was too close to this idea of creation, of a God creating the world. What he did instead was he produced a theory that suggested that the universe is steady state theory. And this theory lasted for about 20 years until 1965 when the microwave background was found that supported basically that the model of the Big Bang, right, was the better explanatory model. But here you had someone coming up with a scientific theory with an explanation of natural phenomena, not on grounds of scientific considerations, but metaphysical ones. Right? Now you might say that's a negative example, right? Here, an atheist does something. How could that work the other way around? There were some Russian mathematicians who gave us, actually, and I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to try to explain all that, but as I understand it, they generated a new theory of infinity and were motivated primarily by the religious beliefs. So there you had mathematicians who thought that a notion of infinity as we think about it in theology might actually be found in mathematics. And this mathematics has actually changed the way that we do physics today. So you can see how, at least on the level of how you come up with theories or how you choose theories, the way that you see the world and believe might actually play a role. Right? Now, Barber suggests there are three main approaches: natural theology, theology of nature, and systematic syntheses. Natural theology, he describes this and thus, and I'm not sure that this is entirely fair. Well, wait, is that me or him? Argues the knowledge of God and of God's attributes can be acquired. That's actually Thomas. Okay, that's good. It's fair. Good. What he says is basically, well, it's the design argument. If you argue from a perspective that you look at nature, you look at the eye, and you can see this is so beautifully designed that it cannot have come about by accident, and that means God has to be there. He says that would be an approach that we can call natural theology. And yes, in the 19th century, that was what natural theology was about, though if we go to natural theology and its origins, then we have to look at Thomas, and that looks a little different. It's a little bit more complex. So I think he's a little unfair there. But one approach that he had in mind, later on at least in his writings, was something like intelligent design. And in what intelligent design approaches do, or I should say the intelligent design movement as we have it now, is really to say that the existence of God can be inferred from evidence in design and nature, of which science has made us aware. Now we can discuss this, why that is highly problematic, at least with what we have right now with the ID movement. There are some approaches, though, that are actually interesting. And one example, well, I mentioned Thomas Aquinas for this approach of integration, natural theology, but you find it also in the work of Brendan Carter, John Barrow, and Frank Tipler, and their suggestion of an anthropic principle. And the anthropic principle, there are different ways of thinking about that, but it's basically the underlying idea is that if you look at physics and you look at the constants, the natural constances, you see that they seem to be fine-tuned. If the constances were off by just a little bit, the universe would just not exist the way it does. So the idea is that nature might actually be fine-tuned. Now, if it's fine-tuned, the question, of course, arises, who does the fine-tuning? Right? And one way one could think about that in a natural theology approach is to say, well, that could be God. Okay, that's one approach. Now, theology of nature, what Barber suggests there is actually slightly different, actually fundamentally different. What he says there is that you start from a religious tradition, from the point of view of a religious tradition, and this point of view is, of course, based in your experience, in your religious experiences, and, yes, in historical revelation. But it holds that some of these doctrines need to be reformed. Now here the fine-tuning is on side of the doctrines, right, rather than the constances. So as science tells us something, gives us insights into natural phenomena and explains them in a certain way, we might not be able to interpret some of our religious ideas the same way that we had them before. So the example that I gave before about creation of the human being in light of evolutionary biology, you would have to basically reinterpret in light of that scientific description. Right? And people who have done that, Théâtre de Chardin certainly, Ted Peters who will be here, and Bob Russell who will be here talking to us. So these are people that have certainly taken this approach very seriously. If you think about it, the dialogue approach that McMullin was talking about goes in that direction, right? The idea of consonance. And then finally, where Barber himself falls is the systematic synthesis, where both theology and science, or religion and science, contribute to a coherent worldview. Right? And that worldview can represent the fundamental characteristics of all events elaborated in a comprehensive metaphysics. So again, here you start with scientific explanations and religious explanations. You bring them together metaphysically. What he suggests, one way that can be done is in process theology. That was what Barber was very fond of. It's one approach. I think there are others. I think if you use a continental philosophical approach to this and hermeneutical approach, then you could do it differently than these guys and still have an integration of these two approaches. Okay. That's basically what these four categories are about. And that's all I got. So why don't we take a break and then we can talk about this.
Now is a good time.
Well, I thought if there are questions about some of the slides.
Oh, yeah, okay. So this would be a good time to ask questions or to raise points with Ollie about, or Oliver, about some of the,
It's fine, all your
the points that he's made in his presentation. And I'll chime in when appropriate.
In Barber's book, he says that Théâtre de Chardin is not really science, it's theology of nature. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yes, well, it depends on what work of Théâtre you look at. I mean, if you of course look at it, right. I mean, if you look at his philosophical or theological writing, yeah, that's a theology of nature.
We better get his name on the board for all of the students. Théâtre de Chardin. He was a Jesuit priest, a paleontologist, and spent a good deal of his life in China because he was exiled by the French Jesuits. Literally put on a slow boat to China, and
It was good for his work, though.
And while it was good for his work, but it also produced a kind of an idiosyncratic product that would not have happened if he had stayed in Europe. It's very synthetic. I would say it's more of a theology, definitely.
I mean, what he yes.
The way you framed the character R in
An R.
Chardin looks an awful lot
Yeah,
like
looks like
an
an
S.
Oh, sorry.
There we are.
And there's a little similarity in
Yes, it did look.
But you knew what I meant, right? That's good. I'm just
familiar
asking.
with the guy.
What?
My wife is a buddy of the woman that's the head of the Théâtre de Chardin Society in England.
Oh, really? Uh-huh. Yeah.
So
But-
that would be a very misleading graphic presentation.
I apologize. I hope that's.
Difference between religion and science.
I'm sorry? What?
I said, and I knew precisely, that's the difference between religion and science.
An R.
No, the way we write our R's, yeah.
Lions and okay, never mind. So the point that the question was: is it theology of nature? Well, if you look at his scientific work, of course, that's paleoanthropology and paleontology. That's science. But when you read his work on the omega point and so forth, where he tries to synthesize these things or bring them together or bring them in dialogue, really, then what you have is really more theology of nature. It's really more theology.
What was that third category you had? You had natural philosophy, theology of nature, and what was it?
Systematic synthesis.
Systematic synthesis. As I was listening to you, I was thinking that Teilhard was perhaps more in that category. But
As I said, I mean, the categories are not, as I
yeah,
said
right,
before,
right. They're just
typologies,
inventions. Yeah,
always
yeah.
tricky that way.
Yeah.
Can you call them a mystical synthesis, kind of using mystical language?
I'd be fine with that. I mean, he certainly used a lot of mystical language, yes.
I remember when I was a student and undergraduate, I had just discovered Teilhard de Chardin here at Stanford. I took a book off the shelf, and it was The Phenomenon of Man, and read it, and thought, oh boy, now I can really begin to work with theology and science, religion and science, I remember going to see one of the professors here in the religion department. Well, actually, it was humanities special programs, and the religion was in there. And I said, I think I might like to write my senior thesis on Teilhard de Chardin. And he said, well, you're going to have to go ask somebody else because I can't make hide nor hair of him. At least he was honest, right?
Yeah.
One little thing is Ian Barber's father worked with Teilhard in China.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
No, I didn't
Yes, he
know
did.
that.
Actually,
really?
Ian met him, and
wow.
because he was in China at the time.
There's a direct connection between
Yeah.
the two.
Yeah, they knew each other.
There was that on the last point of integration. Where does it make sense? Like, where can we delineate where it's fruitful to reinterpret something like doctrine or something like ancient tradition in the light of new scientific knowledge? Given the fact that those created writings or traditions exist in say cultural historical context before the creation of scientific knowledge. It seems that it can be both fruitful and dangerous in some respects, and it's not clear where it is and where it isn't. And there's also the distinction between it often seems to apply more easily with Eastern traditions rather than Western biblical traditions. When you have things like the Tao of physics, for example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, something.
Not a great fan. Very good question. Let's talk about one thing first. Is it possible within a religious tradition to interpret a particular writing, scripture, the same way all the time? No. I mean, the interpretations are something that go over time, and I, as a reader and interpreter of the text, I'm bound within the historical and cultural context in which I exist. And whether the text is meaningful for me or not, that's something that has to be negotiated in my reading of it, and to see whether I can actually, from my particular tradition and time, make heads or tails out of it, whether it means something for me. And that's something that we have in a religious tradition as an ongoing process. Right? Religions always have to reread and reinterpret, in some sense, their religious writings. What does it mean? How do we understand them? Now, part of my historical condition and context is, of course, that science brings new insights, gives me new explanatory models about the physical phenomena. And these physical phenomena have always played a role in religious interpretations of reality. Now, 200 years ago, science was not where it is today, so certain things were interpreted in theology differently. If you go further back, same thing. So how I bring science into that conversation, why that is meaningful, is simply because as a believer, I must take that scientific insight seriously, or else my interpretation of the text might actually make little sense, because the text already tries to explain or give me a hint as to how to understand ultimate reality, not only the physical reality, but everything beyond physical reality as well. So where does it help? Where does it make sense? If you are living today, or in 200 years, and you are a member, or you are within a religious tradition, and you happen to believe, and you want to understand that, one thing you have to do is you have to somehow take that belief and bring it into conversation with what people have to say about the world scientifically. So if you come from a tradition that claims that a supernatural being or a transcendent being, or however you want to claim that to be, or what to call it, has created the world out of nothing, right? Then you will have to say, well, okay, what did the universe look like at its earliest point, as far as we can tell? That will have to tell you have to take that into consideration and take that seriously in order to understand and interpret what it is that you talk about in religion and theology. So is that helpful? If you believe. Now, if you're an atheist, well, that does not mean that you should not know about this stuff, because after all, you're in the game of trying to understand the meaning of your existence just like the believer. Understanding what they're talking about might actually help you to have a conversation. Doesn't mean you have to, you're going to be hit by a light on the way to Damascus.
Just explicate your own.
Right. It might help you to understand and in the conversation get to a better understanding of what it is that you believe in your unbelief. So, but in the end, as an atheist, you might say, well, science explains everything there is to explain, or it might not explain everything, but there are certain things that we make up, love or whatever, and that's good enough. If you're a believer, you will have to bring these two things together. That's basically it. Does that help? Yeah? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that we have a couple of modern examples in the field of science that really illustrate this.
I can't hear you.
It seems to me that we have two very practical, real, worldwide examples in the field of science, medical science, that illustrate this question of belief versus evidence. And there are two cases I would cite where the questions that have gathered around mammography in recent years, and the questions that have gathered around the value of the PSA test in recent years. Now, these two elements of science created mystical beliefs in their properties that persisted throughout the medical profession and throughout the laity for decades, and were held with great fervor. And it's only recently that a re-examination of previous experimental data have revealed new interpretations of that data that refute the conclusions that had been reached earlier, plus new accumulating scientific evidence about how effective is it, have similarly dethroned those two kings or queens, as you choose to identify them. But it shows the power of what on the one hand you could call belief or faith, or on the other hand you could call mob psychology and faith. And I must say, to me, religion is almost entirely composed of the mob psychology and faith. And science at least has this opportunity for self-correction.
Okay. So a few things that we have to unpack here. So what you were talking about was not a relationship of belief in the sense of religion and science. It was something that had to do with negotiating different interpretation models within the natural sciences.
Wait a minute, you can put it that way, but the general public and the medical profession as a whole sees those things and believes them. If that isn't similar to a religious belief, I don't know what is.
Well, okay.
They didn't, well, they
I
haven't.
Well, can I just say something there?
Yeah, sure.
It's certainly you're definitely right. It's a very strong belief in something. It's a
Okay,
both a
I'm
belief
sure it's
that
a-
and it's a belief in. So it's a very and I think what it illustrates is that it's very possible, and in fact, it's quite evident that people do believe in the power of science. And there's a certain kind of security that they find within that. So your point is that you find the same kind of thing going on in religion. The difference is that in the sciences that there's a self-correcting mechanism, and that in religion there is not.
Therefore,
Well,
we should have a lot more faith in science than we do in the mythology of religion.
Well, that's
Well,
a myth.
Well,
That's
I
mythological
certainly,
belief.
if you're only talking mythology, I would probably agree with you there. But there actually is, if you look in the history of religion, let's just take Western religion, take a look at the Christianity in particular. You do, as a matter of fact, find a lot of self-correcting mechanisms, a lot of weighing what is being proposed as doctrine or / theory, and then discovering that this no longer holds water, and either allowing it to go into desuetude or actually declaring it to be erroneous and wrong. And there are many examples of that. So, I mean, I don't want to, though, at the same time say that at least Western religion and science are exact parallels with each other either. I don't want to get into that trap, but it's not entirely accurate to say that about religion. I will readily admit, though, that religion, various kinds of religions, are as susceptible to what you call kind of mob belief as is science. And I think maybe that's something we have to talk to each other about. In fact, belief, what the nature of belief is to me one of the most important things to be looking at, because how does that operate? There's a certain degree to which belief actually enables these systems to function. If we did not believe in the efficacy of science to begin with, then we wouldn't have the scientific establishment that we have. I was thinking of Bronowski, just one other thing, who wrote that something very much along the lines of what you're saying, but for Bronowski, he was calling for a faith in science. In fact, I think that's the title of his book.
Bayesian?
Bronowski
Was calling it a Bayesian?
No, faith. He was calling for faith in science, and that this was a faith that would surpass all religious faith.
Bayesian is a mathematical study.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yes, I'm sorry.
No, I think that's fine. Yeah, Alex.
Would it be fair to basically restate your what you were just saying in terms of Kuhnian paradigms? Would you say that religion / theology / faith practices could be considered to operate in kind of a normal science?
Yeah, you're talking about Thomas Kuhn and the structures of scientific revolutions, right? And where part of his argument, it's more complex than this, but part of his argument is that we can understand the development of modern science in the West as a series of paradigm shifts. As as an older paradigm begins to shake and people have less belief in it, less confidence in it, it eventually gives way for another one. And we'll see this instantiated next week with the Galileo affair.
I have. Okay,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just have to jump in here for one more. Alex, I think you're on target. I think this is really a good way of seeing it. To come back to the question before, my problem is this. Science could be seen as self-correcting, as so beautifully self-correcting as you make it out to be, if it were truly Popperian in nature. What Kuhn has shown, and what others have shown, firearmed among them, is that you still have a lot of problems with this self-correcting approach. Yeah. First thing is, how do you know that the last experiment that was done is really the authoritative? If you're sure about it, you're falling into the same, if you're sure about it, and you're certain about it, you fall into the same trap that you're trying to avoid, right? So all you can say is that at this point, that experiment raises issues that call into question the previous explanatory model. That may or may not be the case, but all that requires, or all that means, is actually that now we don't tell doctors don't do a PSA anymore. We would say, unless we're really pretty convinced that this is falsified, we point out to you we need more research, and it is up to you to evaluate the data and see how you advise your patients to deal with that. Now, I tell you, if
I
you
want
have
to go back
somebody
to
who
Alex
had,
for a minute.
what?
Go ahead.
Crystal clear cases. When Orville and Wilbur Wright flew at Kitty Hawk, they put to waste, for once and for all, the theory that man could never fly.
Right.
I wanted to go back to Alex's thing, though, because you were asking, is there some way in which this kind of an idea could be understood to apply within religion? In fact, Hans Küng, who is a now ailing German theologian, wrote a book, or they held a conference entitled Paradigm Change in Theology, in which they took this idea of paradigms and paradigm shifts that Kuhn puts forth in his book and applied it to theology. And there are a lot of examples there in this book that you might want to take a look at.
Actually,
Would you say that the rise of the Tea Party is an example of a paradigm shift?
no, because it has nothing to do with science, so therefore it's not a Kuhnian shift. But,
Alex, we're going to follow up, though.
Just a quick question on, is that an umlaut over the U or?
Yeah, that's an umlaut.
Okay, thanks.
Actually, Barber himself uses Kuhn. Kuhn was one of the influential philosophers of science that he read and used in his rethinking of how these two fields can relate.
Tom
And
had a
absolutely
question
on.
here, too. Okay.
I mean, you guys very briefly mentioned Chardin's omega point, but I was wondering if maybe you could go into that a little bit more to perhaps explain the integration aspect that Barbara was going on.
Do you want to take it?
I don't care.
Why don't you take it?
Okay.
I'll just write omega.
Okay.
Thank you.
I write point and he takes the rest. Okay. Well, so the first thing you have to understand is that Teilhard was working out of evolutionary biology, right? And what he argued was that you can see actually that in cosmic evolution, starting from the Big Bang and from the origins of the world and of the universe, and through evolutionary through the evolution of life, you see different spheres emerging. Right? At first, all you had was the sphere of matter. Eventually, you get the sphere of life. It doesn't stop there. At one point, you get what he calls the noosphere, which is actually the sphere when life becomes conscious. And what he argues is there is a motion towards consciousness. He argues that the whole universe is moving towards consciousness. And he says it doesn't do so being pushed from below as much as being drawn by that omega point. The universe is moved towards that omega point. Now, two things. What will happen when the world reaches the omega point would be one question, right? It's an important question. And that question he answers actually by identifying the omega point as Christ, God. So everything is moved towards that point. What will happen? Well, what will happen is that the universe assumes consciousness and undergoes, if you like, and I'm using a language that he doesn't use, but I would like to call it that. You have almost like a phase change. Like when you have water to ice or water to steam, here you have a phase change of the universe as noosphere into the transcendent, being taken up into this transcendence that is the omega point, which is God. Right.
The problem with that argument
Let me just first
only the most recent example, and we only have one example.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we're searching for other planets, and we found a couple of thousand of them.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't yet determined whether any of them are green. So it's a totally spacious argument.
Right. So let's still get a little further with that before we tear it apart. So that's the one aspect. Now, what he also says is that we play a role in reaching that point. We can turn away from it. We can turn away from this omega point, from that which draws us. Why? Because we are conscious. And as conscious beings, we have choice. By turning away from it, we might actually drive the whole project into the sand. Okay? So for Teilhard, freedom is essential, and our use of freedom is fundamental and important. Right? So that's basically, in a nutshell, what he's arguing, what this omega point is about. Now, Barber once wrote a text in which he says there are about 6 ways of how you can interpret Teilhard. I'm sure we can find some more. I would say that one problem that I have with Teilhard is, first thing, is it speculative? Of course it's speculative. But just because it's speculative doesn't mean it's bad. Right? I mean, think about what Copernicus did. That was at the time was speculative. Nothing wrong with that. Is it science? No, it's not science. It's theology. So therefore, it cannot be held responsible by the same rules as science, though it is something that has to be taken with an academic rigor within theology. Right? So that negotiates how we can take that as meaningful or not. I think my major problem with the project is that I have a feeling that it's ultimately pantheistic or panentheistic. Now, what I mean by that, I think we don't need this anymore. Can we, how do I drive this up?
Does this do it? No.
Nope. Where do I drive this thing up?
Let's see.
Nope. Oh, here. Duh, it says up.
Oh, he's working with that. May I make a comment?
So, theism would argue that God is fully transcendent and yet fully immanent. Fully transcendent means to be fully outside of time and space, the physical universe as we know it, yet present within the universe and in every part of the universe without being it, without being the universe. How is that possible? In the Christian idea, it would be through, or a theological explanation, it would be through the Holy Spirit that is present everywhere, that is found in everything in nature. Now, deism would be the idea that you have a fully transcendent God who is not immanent. This God creates, basically then steps back and says, okay, there you go. Got you the rules, set you up for it, now that's it. Right? Pantheism would argue that the world is God. Okay, everything that is the universe equals God. You see, these are mutually exclusive. They are. Panentheism is basically that you have the world as the physical expression of God, and yet there's also more to it than that. God is more than just a physical body. There is a transcendent mind, if you like. Right? This actually you can trace back. I think the first one who really came up with a panentheistic explanatory model was Hegel. I think that's where you find it for the first time. But at any rate, the point is, pantheism or panentheism has this idea of the world being God. And so the question is, this phase change, the omega point is there in the future, pulling the world, and the world undergoes this phase change to become one with God. But in order for it to undergo a phase change, well, ice does not change fundamentally into something else when it becomes steam. It's a different, my goodness, I hope it's just allergies. And if it's against me, I'm almost done. Hang in there. To me, it sounds as if he's suggesting or he's arguing from a panentheistic perspective. But that's one way of reading him. That's why I find him theologically and philosophically problematic. But that's because I'm invested in theism. Somebody who isn't would say, hey, that's just fine. Right? Does that help a little? Like when they do that. You may sneeze now. No. Oops.
Mary Margaret?
The anthropic principle.
Yes.
It just means we can't know the universe directly. We can only know the universe through our cognitive faculties.
No.
Right? And so therefore, when we say there's quantum mechanics and boson particles and all of that sort of stuff, it's only because of what we're seeing.
Mm-mm.
No? What does that principle
Well,
mean?
the first thing, the easiest way of saying, of wrapping up the anthropic principle would have to be the laws of nature are so that there can be life that is conscious, and we know that because we are life that is conscious. That would be the easiest way of saying it. And then, there are different ways of interpreting it.
But
Some
we
would.
see it that way because we are self-conscious.
Well, we
because
prove
we
that
have
we prove that that the universe is set up, that the laws of nature are set up to produce. Well, this is where it gets into the different interpretations. You can say that laws of physics are such that self-conscious life can emerge. We know this because guess what? We're self-conscious. You can also say, in a more stronger interpretation, it's set up so that self-conscious life will emerge. Fundamentally, both sides or both interpretations still argue with the same fundamental idea. If you look at the laws of nature, they're so narrowly formed that just a small deviation would actually mean that that the world as we know it couldn't be. Right?
Well, if you can understand why my understanding of intelligent design, I could see why people would really jump on that anthropic principle as filling one of the gaps.
Yeah, but that's the
But it's
important thing.
more
It's
than
different. It's way different. It's not a design argument at all.
Okay.
It's not a design argument at all. It's not intelligent design. It's not saying, look, the complexity of your brain doesn't allow any other explanation than there has to be a watchmaker. That's not what they're saying. All they're saying is the laws of nature are thus that there can be life. And if the laws were slightly different, there wouldn't be life. And we know that the laws are like that because we're here. Yes?
Are there modern day theologians that build on the work of Teilhard
Yes.
in light of current science?
Yes, there are a number of them. Yeah.
Well, Karl Rahner took him seriously, but didn't build on him.
So the person that Paul is just talking about is with an R, not an S. Karl. And another R. Karl Rahner. He was a German Jesuit, and what he does is in his theology, he takes evolutionary biology, like Teilhard did, very seriously. And so at times it sounds like he rehashes what Chardin had to say, but he doesn't. He's philosophically and theologically far sounder and stronger. Well, he was not trained as a scientist, but as a philosopher and theologian. Teilhard was trained as a scientist and not as a philosopher and theologian, so it doesn't surprise too much. But you have others like Jack Hott, for example, who takes Teilhard very seriously. John Hott, Catholic theologian. Let me see, who else? Yes, Thomas Berry would be another
Yeah.
one. So there are a number of people who take him still very
What about
seriously.
those people at Yale, Evelyn and
Tucker,
the Tuckers,
yes,
yeah.
same thing, and can't think of her name right now.
There is an evolutionary non.
Yeah.
She's right over here.
What's her name?
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Ilia Delio.
Delio.
Yeah,
Delio.
yeah,
Exactly.
Ilia Delio,
Ilia Delio.
yeah.
So there are a number of people who actually still use Teilhard.
We had a conference on Teilhard
Yeah,
in Santa
a few
Clara
years-
a couple of
few
years,
years ago.
maybe 3 years ago
Yeah.
now. Yeah, brought them
And-
all in.
And I mean, there's if nothing else, I mean, there's a lot to be said for Teilhard's approach, I think. I mean, let's put it this way. First off, well, he changed the way that the Catholic Church thought about these things. That was important. I think that spiritual approach, I don't know, you might want to call it mystical approach, is very valuable and helpful in making meaning of reality.
Although there is a story, as there is with most of these theologians, Teilhard's teaching or writing, his thinking, was not immediately accepted by Rome
Right,
by a long shot. They had several problems with his work, and so he wasn't able to publish anything more during his lifetime. That was under Pope Pius XII, and then John the 23rd came in. Meanwhile, a friend of his had collected all of his stuff, took care of it and everything. And as soon as John the 23rd said that it was okay to publish it, it all came out. So it made a huge splash in the early 60s, just before the calling of the Second Vatican Council. It kind of became the space age theology, you know.
Like that. Yeah, let's have somebody who hasn't asked anything yet.
So it seems that the four different kind of philosophies that you've written there would have to have somewhat different perspectives on the concept of free will, because God is either immanent or not. Is that a fair assessment?
Well,
just for the premise.
It depends on how you, it depends on how you unpack that. I mean, I think pantheism would have probably the hardest problem with free will. Panentheism might leave some room. Theism certainly has it. Deism would have tons of it. It's just that, they're the laws of nature, and whatever you do within them, that's your problem.
So one of the interesting things I learned about in my class on quantum mechanics somewhat recently was that in quantum mechanics, you actually, the current paradigm, at least, is that you can't deterministically predict what your observation will be, that there's an expectation value, and when you observe it, it will come into one of what they call the eigenstates, which are the like time-independent solutions of some equation that nobody really needs to know about. But I'm wondering what the recent philosophers and theologians that would have been contemporaries of the physicists coming up with these sorts of things would have to say about those theories. And
we'll have one here. Bob Russell is a physicist and a theologian who has actually worked with these questions quite a bit, and his question is really on the issue of divine action, which you can subsume the question of freedom under the question of divine action, theologically speaking.
Celia Dean Drummond also is
Celia Dean Drummond will speak
that.
directly to free will. But Bob she's a biologist. Bob, as a physicist, he has looked at questions that were raised by quantum mechanics, that were raised by other things. Now, to tell you quickly how he resolves this in terms of divine action, is actually that he says, look, quantum mechanics is not a problem for divine action. He believes it actually makes divine action for a modern theologian possible. You see, before, divine action was an explanatory theological model for something that science couldn't explain. At that point, you have a God of the gaps. That's a problem, right? If I have a God of the gaps, then there's a problem. God of the gaps basically means that you put in God everywhere where science can't explain. The moment that science can explain, God will become a little smaller and smaller. Eventually, God goes poof. Right? Now, what Bob says is this. He says, look, there are different ways of interpreting this uncertainty, right? But if you go with Copenhagen, you would have to say it's ontological. In other words, it's not an epistemological problem, it's an ontological problem. We cannot know this not because we are not small enough to observe it. It's simply in nature that this is unclear. Nature is not deterministic at its fundamental level. Now, if you want God to act objectively, that is really altering the course of nature, and if God were to act in nature by suspending the laws of science, well, then you have a problem for all sorts of reasons. You have a God of gaps argument, you have, all sorts of problems. But here, you have actually something that science cannot describe, deterministically grasp, right? You cannot make a deterministic prediction. right? And yet if God were the one collapsing the wave function, then God could act there without being a God of the gaps explanation, because it's an ontological uncertainty.
My problem with that approach, and I mean, I with all due respect
I have problems with it.
yeah, because he's smarter than I am on these things, I know that. But is that we've gone through this in history before, where we have tried to provide some kind of explanation of God or description of God, the being of God, God's attributes, by employing what is the science of the day. So we saw that, for example, after Newtonian physics, as I mentioned this the other night, and once that particular model is surpassed by another one, then you're left hanging.
Yeah,
you know? It's a.
But at that point, you could not do theology and science, he would argue.
Well, you certainly can't. But I wouldn't even try. I mean,
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, because the other thing is, to go back to some of those models that you were looking at from Barber, I think one of the things that also leaves out are the, as some of these 18th century theologians would have put it, the evidences of religion. In other words, what you're doing is you're arguing to a God without taking into account whatever religious experience is. And that whole field of data that is very essential to what religion is about.
Okay.
Somehow that we have to deal with that.
And now I have to do what I always do, because Bob is my Doktorvater, he was my PhD advisor, and though I disagree with him on iota, I understand what he means, so I'm always explaining, I'm always defending him. So we'll do that here too.
Okay.
Let me just say quickly what I wrote down here is what he calls this quantum non-interventionist objective divine action, or quantum iota. He loves abbreviations, right? And I used to, my master's thesis was actually on the hermeneutics of theology and science, and if you make an abbreviation of that, it would be hot ass. And I thought that would be really great. But anyway, didn't use that. So, just saying.
Good.
But, right, there you go. But, Paul, I think that's a little unfair. Okay, let me explain why.
Okay.
First thing, he's a critical realist. As a critical realist, he would say that both our science, our science as well as our theology is not final, right? I mean, we're still developing these things.
Sure.
Yet at the same time, he says we have to take the science seriously. Now, if the ontological interpretation doesn't hold, he's absolutely in agreement, then the whole project would be for naught. But it is the best scientific explanatory model we have at this point. And the way that he does theology and science, and I think that's very valid, he wants to take that seriously, and he wants to work with that science. And from that perspective, it really opens up that conversation. And as such, you're right. I mean, that's what theology has always done. And that's okay. I mean, that's what we do in theology. I think that's a fair approach. I mean, I agree
Well,
that
it's fair, but
Yeah.
I still would maintain that it, and again, I'm not arguing against Bob's work.
Right.
This is more of an historical argument. The history of this tells us that if you disregard some of the evidences of religion itself and are only arguing within the paradigm to science.
How does it do that?
Huh?
I'm not sure how it does that. Why is that disregarding
Well, I
the
mean,
experience?
what I get is some kind of an idea of you're starting out with a picture of a quantum universe, right?
Right.
Okay, and what you're trying to find is somehow in the indeterminacy there an opening for divine action, right? What does that say about, what kind of presuppositions are we making about God in constructing an argument like that? I mean, where do we get with that? Especially, I think it might make it's a certain kind of theology of nature, in which you have some kind of a God that fits into the current paradigm of science. But I'm not so sure that it's a theology of God.
I don't know. I mean, what he's arguing is basically, and I'll take your question in 1 second. And
Yeah.
again, I mean, you know, to be very honest, I'm not an iota person. But I think, again, I think it does take experience seriously. And it, I mean, look.
I guess the question is how.
Well,
The question is
for him, the important thing is that things like the resurrection is something that is possible within the context, even within the context of modern science.
Yeah, but
So-
again, through some kind of scientific explanation, right?
No, it's not a scientific explanation.
Mm.
It's a metaphysical and theological explanation. It's just that he uses the science as an in. It opens up the possibility. That's all. He's not trying to explain God scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Well, it seems to me that quantum mechanics is a bit of a red herring here. I mean, isn't this similar to ideas about God's action that existed before quantum mechanics that identify the action of God with chance? I mean, is there an essential difference in...
Can you say more? I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, I believe actually it was even in... well, I'm not sure if it was in Barber or not, but anyway, there are arguments that chance represents the action of God in the world. Those events that we ascribe to chance can be ascribed by a believer to the action of God.
Okay.
And isn't this just that argument dressed up in more contemporary scientific language?
If you like, I mean, the point is really, chance here is understood as indeterminacy, right? True chance. I mean, it's ontologically indeterminate, so therefore, it's not the chance that I run into you in the street and say, oh my God, what are the odds running into you here in the streets and I don't know where we are, right? Reykjavik. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is this is a chance that is ontological in the sense of quantum mechanics. I mean, this is something that...
Isn't the odds that I'll run into you in the street, though, inherently a stochastic kind of phenomenon? I mean, doesn't it have
well, depends on...
an inherently probabilistic component
Why?
to it?
Scientifically speaking, it's deterministic. I mean, unless you define everything that we do down to quantum mechanics, in which case, well, then everything would be actually probabilistic, but then also you would be arguing from a reductionistic perspective where everything is just describable, even biological interactions, on the level of...
You're saying that your and my meeting would not fit a chance event because you and I are both carrying out intentions that somehow might be related
and those
to
are
each other.
deterministic. I
We're going to have to call it there for the
Well,
public part, but we can continue this afterwards.
Physically speaking, there are
If anybody
deterministic.
wants to stay, they're more than welcome to. Thank you.
Thank you.